Hello, welcome to Election Bites, our conversations about key election issues. We want to apologize because we were not able to go live with this because we were having lots of technical difficulties. I apologize, but this is still life in the pandemic, I guess. So I'm Soya Ellison. I'm an Associate Director of Communications here at the Carter Center. And joining me today is Leah Merivaki. Leah is an assistant professor in American politics at Mississippi State University and also one of our U.S. election expert team members. So thanks for being here, Leah.
My pleasure.
Well, so today we're going to talk about something that everybody's talking about right now, I feel like. We're going to talk about election reform. Of course, what that means depends on who you ask. But I want to ask you, what do you think that reform means? And what are some of the different features that it can take?
This is a great question, and it appears that it's simple, but it really isn't. So I'll get straight to it. Generally, when we're discussing election reform, we usually talk about policies that expand voter access and make voting processes more convenient, like online voter registration or no excuse voting by mail. But because the conduct of elections has become more data-driven and relies heavily on technology, reform also includes the adoption of additional security protocols like signature verification practices for absentee voting, or standardized poll worker training, or mandatory pre-election logic and accuracy tests and post-election audits. Now, increasing oversight and accountability in elections has always been on the reform list as well. For instance, regulating who can submit an absentee ballot on behalf of a voter, or requiring that any group that assists eligible voters to register to vote are certified to do so by the state. And last but not least, reforming elections can also go in a different direction, such as scaling back on existing policies. Let's say reducing how many days early in-person voting is allowed in a state, or restricting the ability of state and local election officials to rely on private funding when it comes to adopting innovations in elections, or anything that is considered a scale back from an existing practice. So when talking about reforms, there are, as you noted, multiple dimensions, from expanding to restricting voter access, to voter security on voting process, and eliminating voter fraud, as well as oversight and accountability.
Okay, I want to ask you more about restricting versus expanding, but I'm going to wait. And first, I'm going to ask you this. So election reform can take place at two different levels, right? The federal level or the state level. So is there any indication that we might see some reform on the federal level? And if so, what could that look like?
Yes, that is a great question. And this is a good timing, particularly in the aftermath of the 2020 election. At the moment, there are two big legislative proposals in Congress that were both passed by the Democratic House in 2019. One of them is called H.R. 1 for the People Act, and H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. So both of them were passed in the House in 2019. And they have been stalled in the Senate. H.R. 1 is a very comprehensive election reform policy that aims to increase the oversight of the federal government in elections at the state, across the states, by mandating standard uniform voting policies like mail voting, early in-person voting, online voter registration. So the expectation is that all states would establish these practices and also establish a constant, continuous flow of federal funds to state and local election officials to improve election administration generally and specifically protect the security of the election process by investing in security infrastructure. H.R. 1 also has different provisions that involve disclosure of campaign finance and ethics, as well as requirements on disclosing tax returns for presidential candidates. But in terms of running elections and election administration, it's very comprehensive, and it's a major effort by the federal government to oversee how elections are run across the states. Now, H.R. 4 has a more narrow focus, specifically aims to restore the Voting Rights Act provisions that were struck down by the Supreme Court in 2003 in Selby v. Holder. So what this means, essentially, the proposal aims to bring back the federal administrative review requirement in specific states and jurisdictions that have history of racial discrimination, or have had a history with adopting discriminatory election laws. So it brings back the requirement that they have to meet a certain formula in order to be removed from federal oversight, and they have to clear, so the pre-clearance requirement, they have to clear election policies with the Department of Justice before implementing it. So those two bills are currently at play. We don't know what the future of them will be, how they will proceed in the Senate, but they constitute the most recent efforts by the federal government to have a say in how elections are run at the state level.
Okay, so that's,
yeah.
Nope, sorry, I interrupted you. I didn't mean to. Go ahead.
No, it is okay. It is okay. I just one final note on that. HR 1 has several election reforms that states have already been implementing. Like many states have mail voting, and many states have election day registration, and they do have early in-person voting, but many states do not. So the goal of this federal policy is to establish these uniform practices that help voters be able to cast their vote in a secure manner.
Okay. So that's federal, but as we know, the states right now, the states are the ones who run these elections. So I'm wondering, are you seeing all the states are doing, I know, introducing various bills that may or may not pass, but are you seeing any trends in the kinds of things that are being proposed across various states? And do they match up with what might happen federally, or are they different?
That is a great question. The short answer is yes and no, as with everything. So because of COVID, the states really innovated in how they run elections, and they expanded access to voting because they had to facilitate those voters who did not want to go to vote in person. So especially mail voting. And right now, states have the opportunity to reconsider whether they want to keep these policies on the books or they want to amend them or eliminate them altogether. So some states are considering keeping these policies because voters use them predominantly and they work well. Some states, on the other hand, are considering scaling back on early in-person voting. Iowa is one of the states that right now is considering doing that, Georgia, and of course many others. So scaling back on early voting and mail voting, either by limiting how early a voter can vote on election day, or requiring an excuse to vote by mail, or submitting additional documentation as proof of eligibility when someone casts their vote by mail. A lot of these restrictions are proposed based on concerns about the integrity of the election process. And there was a lot of controversy about mail voting and not being secure and voter fraud. So, for example, adding an additional proof of identification, for example, when someone submits a mail vote, theoretically is intended to minimize the potential for voter fraud. It is not very clear how limiting access to early voting or eliminating the practice of having secure drop boxes, which are locked and are under security surveillance, how these restrictions protect the integrity of elections. Often such decisions may reflect budgetary and administrative constraints, such as election officials have to rent polling places and they have to staff and train poll workers for early in-person voting locations. So administrative barriers can explain this decision to scale back on early in-person voting, for example, but the relationship between these restrictions and integrity is not very clear and not very much established, at least in research. Some states are also considering eliminating election day registration, which is considered to be the golden policy when it comes to voter access, because it eliminates the challenge to register to vote in advance. So that is a very interesting development at the state level. And legislators are citing administrative burdens and easing the work of election officials who already have to deal with voters who check in at the polls, and removing the requirement to register to vote as well might make their job a little bit easier. Now, comparing the federal initiatives that you mentioned, as I summarized them above, and the initiatives by some states, it is becoming clear that priorities can be very, very different, and that can create conflict once the federal government attempts to adopt them. So, because constitutionally states are in charge of running their elections, so they have jurisdiction. If HR 4, the Restoration of Voting Rights Act, passes, for example, states will have to demonstrate that their policies are not discriminatory and go under federal administrative review. If HR 4 doesn't pass, it is very likely that because we have these different priorities at the state and federal level, we will see possibly litigation by advocacy groups to the states to pressure them to scale back and repeal those restrictions, particularly because they change existing practices that are by definition more expansive.
Okay, so this is the last question. This goes back to that one I said I wanted to ask you about. And maybe it's the most important one, but listen, why are voter access and election integrity talked about as if they are contradictory goals? Like, isn't it possible that we could both have an election that is secure and is accessible to the greatest number of people?
That is again that is a golden question. So over time, states and the federal government have been struggling with designing electoral institutions that make voting accessible and easy for voters without undermining the integrity of the election process. And realistically, because policy making is a political process, legislators have different definitions of what access means and what integrity means. The two should not be contradictory, however. No one wants to make a policy that invites voter fraud, for example, or the ability to hack voting technology and registration database. And I hope no one wants to make voters to literally jump through hoops in order to cast a ballot. We can have both. And in many states, election processes are designed and they work and they ensure access as well as integrity. The challenges arise when the adoption of policies that arguably aim to secure elections place burden on voters, which are deemed unnecessary and do not meet the goal of actually securing the election process. And when I say deemed unnecessary, the evidence comes from social science research, as well as court decisions that rule that some policies have been unconstitutional and they are discriminatory. So we have the evidence from very recent court decisions. But I do want to finish with a positive note, especially on the debate between access and integrity, that in times of crisis, such as the COVID pandemic, states run elections in a remarkably innovative manner. We know that a lot of these policies worked because voters were able to cast their votes at record-breaking rates, even if they had to do it from their home. And many of them did it in person by waiting hours in line. Of course, glitches will always exist, but this is a great opportunity to review what worked and what did not, keeping in mind that the right to vote is sacred and that election reforms need to be voter-centric and that election integrity can be secured without imposing burdens on the voter.
Very good. Well, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. This was really interesting. So thank you, Leah, for your time. And thank you to our viewers. Again, sorry about our technical glitches, but we appreciate you being with us, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.